The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, merciless and indifferent. Two women ran across the cracked earth, their feet bleeding through worn leather, one carrying a child who had stopped crying hours ago. They had learned to fear every shadow, every sound, every stranger, especially men who looked like the ones who had destroyed everything they knew. But when exhaustion finally drove them to the door of an isolated homestead, what they found inside would shatter every belief they carried. Because sometimes the monster you expect to find turns out to be the only soul willing to die for strangers he never should have helped. Niley's legs had stopped feeling like her own 2 days ago. Now they were just meat and bone that somehow kept moving, carrying her forward through the endless expanse of sand and stone. The child in her arms had grown impossibly heavy. Or perhaps Nieli had simply grown impossibly weak. She couldn't tell anymore where exhaustion ended and her body began. Beside her, Istis moved with the determination of someone who had decided death would have to work harder to claim her. Blood stained the side of her sister's dress, a dark patch that had been growing since they fled. Neither of them spoke about it. Speaking about wounds made them real, made them dangerous, made them something that could stop you. The sun hung low, painting the horizon in shades of copper and ash. In another life, Nile might have found it beautiful. Now it only meant they were running out of time to find shelter before darkness brought predators of a different kind. Ista stopped abruptly, her hand shooting out to grip Nile's arm. The touch was iron. Urgent. She pointed ahead with her chin, her other hand moving instinctively to the knife at her belt. Through the heat, shimmer, a structure emerged from the landscape like something that shouldn't exist. A house small and weathered, standing alone in the vast emptiness. No other buildings nearby. No signs of life, except a thin line of smoke rising from a stone chimney. Nile's throat tightened. Every instinct screamed to keep running, to find somewhere else, anywhere else. Houses meant people. People meant danger. People who looked like the ones they were running from meant death or worse. But the child in her arms stirred weakly, her small lips, cracked and bleeding from thirst. The sound she made was barely human, more like the whimper of a dying animal. That sound cut through every fear Nally carried. "We have no choice," Nally whispered, her voice raw and broken. Istis' jaw clenched, the muscles in her face rigid with fury and desperation, wearing for dominance. Her fingers tightened around the knife handle until her knuckles went white. For a long moment, she said nothing, just stared at that distant structure like it was a gallows waiting to receive them. Finally, she nodded once. Sharp final. They moved toward the house slowly. Every step, a negotiation between hope and terror. As they drew closer, details emerged. The wood was old but maintained, the windows intact. A small garden plot near the side showing signs of recent care. Someone lived here. Someone who stayed. Nil's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might break through. The child's weight in her arms felt like both anchor and purpose, the only thing keeping her from collapsing or fleeing. 20 feet from the door, they stopped. Istis positioned, herself slightly ahead, her body a shield between Naeli and whatever waited inside. The knife was fully visible now, a clear message that they would not go quietly if this turned into what they feared it would. The door remained closed. No sound came from within. The smoke continued its lazy climb into the darkening sky, indifferent to the drama unfolding below. Nali opened her mouth to call out, but her voice had abandoned her. Instead, only a dry rasp emerged, barely audible even to herself. That's when the door opened, slow and deliberate, and everything they believed about monsters and men began to unravel. The man who emerged from the doorway was tall, his frame filling the entrance, but not blocking it completely. His movements were slow, deliberate, hands visible at his sides. He wore simple clothes, all earth-tone tones, nothing that gleamed or caught the fading light. His hair hung past his shoulders with gray, and his face carried lines that spoke of years spent squinting against this same merciless sun. He stopped in the doorway, making no move to step forward. His eyes took in the scene before him with an expression Nieli couldn't read. Not anger, not hunger, something else entirely, something that made her chest tighten with confusion rather than fear. Istis raised the knife higher, her stance widening into something battle. Ready. Her voice came out like gravel scraped across stone. Stay back. The man's gaze moved from Istis to Naeli, then down to the child in her arms. Something shifted in his face, a tightening around his eyes that might have been recognition or pain or both. He raised his hands slowly, palms out, the universal gesture of surrender. He said nothing, just stood there, hands raised, waiting. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of wind across sand and the labored breathing of three women who had run too far for too long. Niley felt the child's body growing heavier, more limp in her arms. The small chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular patterns. The man's eyes never left the child, then moving with the careful slowness of someone approaching a wounded animal, he stepped backward into his house, disappeared from view. Istis tensed, shifting her weight forward, ready to run or fight or both. But he reappeared almost immediately, carrying something, a clay pitcher beaded with condensation, a metal cup. He set them down on the threshold, then backed away again, putting distance between himself and the offerings. Water. Naali's throat convulsed at the sight of it. The child in her arms made that terrible sound. Again, the whimper that wasn't quite human anymore. Istis' knife hand trembled, though whether from exhaustion or emotion, Naali couldn't tell. The man retreated further into his house, creating more space, more safety. He sat down slowly on a wooden chair just inside the door, making himself smaller, less threatening. Then he spoke, his voice rough from disuse, but surprisingly gentle. For the child, just water, nothing else. His accent was thick but understandable, the words carefully chosen and spaced. He made no move to approach, no gesture that could be interpreted as aggression. He simply sat, hands resting on his knees, and waited. Nieli looked at her sister. Istis' face was a mask of fury and calculation, every muscle tight with the need to protect and the knowledge that protection might mean accepting help from the last person they should trust. The child's breathing grew more labored. A rattling sound emerged from her tiny chest that made Nieli's blood run cold. Istis, she whispered, her voice breaking. Her sister's jaw clenched so hard Nieli heard teeth grinding. The knife remained raised, but Istis' eyes had moved to the child, seeing what Nieli already knew. They were out of time. Nieli took a step forward, then another. Istis moved with her, the knife now pointed at the man in the chair. A clear promise of what would happen if this was a trap. Nieli reached the threshold and knelt, never taking her eyes off the man. She set the child down, gently, then reached for the pitcher with shaking hands. The water inside was cool, impossibly precious. She poured carefully into the cup, brought it to the child's cracked lips. The man in the chair hadn't moved. His eyes held, something Nieli had never seen in the face of someone who looked like him. She couldn't name it, didn't trust it, but couldn't deny it was there. Behind them, the horizon had gone dark, and in that darkness, something moved. The child drank in desperate gulps, water spilling down her chin and soaking in her dress. Nieli held the cup steady, her hand still trembling when Istis' voice cut through the moment like a blade. Riders. The single word turned Nieli's blood to ice. She spun, still cradling the child, and saw what her sister had already spotted. Against the darkening horizon, 5 shapes moved with purpose. Horses, men coming directly toward the house. The man in the chair rose smoothly, his gaze fixed on the approaching riders. His expression hadn't changed, but something in his posture shifted, became harder. He looked at the women, then at the riders, calculating distances in time with the practiced eye of someone who had made such calculations before. He spoke quickly, his voice low and urgent. Inside now, back room. Ista's knife came up again, distrust flooding back across her face. This could be the trap they'd been expecting. Lure them in with water, then hand them over to whoever was hunting them. But the man wasn't looking at them anymore. He was moving through his house with swift efficiency, grabbing items as he went. A rifle from above the door, a worn leather coat from a peg. He shrugged into the coat, checked the rifle's load, then finally turned back to them. Those men aren't coming for supper, he said flatly. You want to find out what they want? Stay here. You want to live? Get in the back room and don't make a sound. The riders were closer now, close enough that Naeli could hear the thunder of hooves against hard earth, could see the dust cloud rising behind them, close enough to see that they carried weapons, openly, ready for use. The man moved quickly to the kitchen area, knelt down, and lifted a section of floorboard that looked identical to all the others. Beneath it, darkness opened into a space that smelled of earth and old vegetables. A root cellar, hidden and small. Down here now, he said urgently. Naeli looked at her sister. This could be the trap they feared. Going underground with no escape route, at the mercy of a stranger. But the thunder of approaching hooves grew louder with each passing second. The man looked back at them, and New York saw something in his face that made no sense. Resignation, perhaps, or determination. The look of someone about to do something they knew would cost them. Why? Nile heard herself, asked, her voice barely a whisper. His mouth tightened into something that might have been a smile if smiles could be built from grief. Because I've already been the monster, he said simply. Don't aim to be one again. Istis grabbed Naeli's arm, pulling her toward the opening. They climbed down into the cramped darkness. The child pressed between them. The space was barely large enough for 2 women and a small child. No light, no escape route. A tomb, just as Istis had feared. Above them, the floorboard slid back into place with a soft scraping sound. Through the cracks between boards, they could see fragments of movement. Could hear the man's boots crossing the floor as he walked back through his front door, stepping out onto the porch to meet the approaching riders. Naeli pressed herself against the earthen wall. The child clutched tight to her chest. Istis crouched low, knife ready, peering up through the cracks between floorboards, watching everything above. The thunder of hooves grew louder, then stopped. Voices rose harsh and demanding. The man's voice answered, calm and steady, though they couldn't make out the words. Then one voice rose above the others, sharp with authority and cruelty both. We're tracking 2 Apache women and a child. Saw them heading this direction. You seen anyone? Through the cracks in the floorboards above them, they saw the man's silhouette against the dying light. He stood alone, rifle held loosely but ready, facing 5 mounted men armed and clearly prepared for violence. Haven't seen anyone, he said, his voice carrying through the still evening air. Been working the land all day alone. Mind if we look around? The man shifted his stance slightly. The rifle's position changed with him. No longer loose, no longer casual. The movement was subtle, but the message was clear. Yes, he said simply. A mind. The silence that followed was the kind that comes before lightning strikes. Naeli stopped breathing. Beside her, even, Istis had gone perfectly still. What happened in the next few seconds would decide whether they lived or died. And the man who stood between them and those riders was about to pay a price for protecting strangers. He had no reason to shelter. The lead rider dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the ground with deliberate weight. He was broad-shouldered with a face weathered by sun and violence both. A badge glinted on his chest, catching the last rays of daylight. His hand rested on the revolver at his hip, not gripping it, but making sure everyone saw exactly where it was. "That's an unfriendly attitude for an innocent man," he said, moving closer to the porch. The other four riders remained mounted, positioned in a loose semicircle, their weapons visible and ready. Kill didn't move. His rifle remained in that careful position, not aimed but not harmless either. "I value my privacy. That makes a man unfriendly, not guilty." The rider with the badge smiled, but it never reached his eyes. He glanced past Kale toward the house, studying the windows, the door, looking for any sign of what he knew was hiding inside. "Those women are dangerous. Killed 2 men 3 days back. Stole supplies. They're fugitives from justice." Through the crack in the door, Natalie felt her chest constrict. Estes' hand tightened on the knife until her knuckles went bone white. The child in Nieli's arms had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, her small body hot with fever. Kale's voice came back steady, almost bored. "Then I hope you find them, but they're not here. Now get off my land." The man with the badge took another step forward. His fingers drummed against the grip of his revolver, a casual gesture that held volumes of threat. "You know what I think? I think you're one of those Indian sympathizers. Heard there were a few scattered out here in the empty places. Men who forgot which side they should be on." Something changed in Kale's posture. It was subtle, barely visible, but Nali saw it. A tightening across his shoulders, a shift in his weight. When he spoke again, his voice had gone flat and cold. "I'm not on any side. I left all that behind years ago. You'd be wise to do the same and ride on." "Can't do that." The man with the badge shook his head slowly. "God orders to search every structure within 10 miles. That includes this one. So you can step aside peaceful, or we can move you aside. Your choice." The 4 mounted men shifted, hands moving closer to their weapons. The evening air had gone still. That breathless quality that comes before violence erupts. Kale stood silent for a long moment. Then he did something that made no sense, something that contradicted every survival instinct a person should have. He lowered the rifle completely, set it against the porch railing, stepped down from the porch with his hands open and empty at his sides. "You want to search?" he said, quietly. "You'll do it over my dead body." Niley's breath caught through the crack. She watched this man who owed them nothing, knew nothing about them, place himself between them and armed men who would certainly kill him if necessary. He stood alone, unarmed now, facing 5 armed riders with nothing but his body as a barrier. The man with the badge stared at him, confusion and anger wearing across his face. "You're willing to die for people you claim you haven't seen." Kale's response was simple, delivered with absolute certainty. "I'm willing to die to protect the right to be left alone on my own land. What I've seen or haven't seen doesn't concern you. This is where your authority ends and mine begins." The mounted men looked at each other, uncertainty rippling through their formation. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. People were supposed to cooperate, to surrender, to recognize when they were outmatched. The man with the badge's hand moved fully to his revolver grip now. His jaw clenched, decision forming behind his eyes. What happened next would reveal exactly how far the stranger was willing to go. The revolver cleared the holster in a smooth, practiced motion. The man with the badge leveled it at Kale's chest, his finger resting against the trigger. "Guard." His voice dropped to something dangerous and quiet. "Last chance. Step aside." Kyle didn't move, didn't flinch. He stood there with the barrel pointed at his heart, his face carved from stone, and said nothing at all. The mounted men exchanged glances. This had gone wrong somehow, turned into something none of them had signed up for. One of them, younger than the others, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Mason, the young one said carefully, addressing the man with the badge. Maybe we should just move on. Could be he's telling the truth. Could be. They went another direction. Mason's jaw worked, his eyes never leaving Kyle's face. The gun remained steady, but something in his expression suggested he was calculating odds, weighing consequences. Shooting an unarmed man on his own property, even out here in the empty places, could bring questions he didn't want to answer. You know what? I think, Mason said slowly, his voice taking on a different tone. I think you're hiding something. Maybe not those women, but something. And I'm going to remember this. Going to remember you. He lowered the revolver slightly, but kept it drawn. Took a step back. Boys, he called, without turning. Mark this location. We'll be coming back through here in a few days. And if I find out you lied to me today, there won't be enough left of you to bury. Kyle's expression didn't change, but Naeli saw his shoulders drop almost imperceptibly. Relief or exhaustion or both. Mason holstered his weapon finally, but before turning away, he moved fast, faster than seemed possible. His fist connected with Kale's jaw in a vicious strike that sent the man stumbling backward. Kale caught himself on the porch railing, blood already streaming from his split lip. That's for wasting my time, Mason said pleasantly. He gestured to his men. Let's go. We'll search the Morrison place before dark. They mounted up, the horses wheeling in tight circles, kicking up dust. But Mason paused, looking back one more time at Kale, who had straightened despite the blood running down his chin. Real curious what you're protecting out here all alone, Mason said. Be seeing you real soon. Then they rode, their forms dissolving into the gathering darkness, the thunder of hooves fading gradually, until only silence remained. Kale stood on his porch, swaying slightly, one hand pressed to his jaw. He waited, watching the horizon until the last trace of the riders had disappeared. Only then did he turn back toward his house, moving slowly like every step cost him. Inside the back room, Naeli and Istis remained, frozen. They had witnessed everything through that narrow crack. Seen a man stand alone against impossible odds. Seen him take a beating for protecting strangers he had no obligation to shelter. Seen him do exactly what the title of their whole lives had told them was impossible. A white man had chosen to suffer for them, had risked death, had bled. The door to their room opened fully. Kale stood there, blood still, dripping from his jaw, his eyes meeting theirs. For a long moment, no one spoke. The space between them was filled with 1,000 unspoken questions, with beliefs shattering and reforming into new shapes. Finally, Kale's voice came rough and tired. They'll be back. Maybe tomorrow, maybe in 3 days, but they'll come back. You need to rest tonight, then move at first light. I'll point you towards safe territory. He turned to leave, but Istis's voice stopped him. Why? The question hung in the air, heavy, with everything it really meant. Why help them? Why risk everything? Why defy every expectation and history between their peoples? Kale's hand came up to his jaw, probing the damage gently when he spoke. His voice carried the weight of old ghosts and older regrets. Because a long time ago I didn't, and I've been trying to make that right ever since. He walked away then, leaving them with that cryptic answer and the sound of his boots against wooden floorboards, leaving them to process what they just witnessed, what it meant, how it changed everything they thought they knew about monsters and men. But the night wasn't finished with them yet. Outside, in the darkness beyond the house, new sounds emerged, different from the riders, closer and growing louder with each passing moment. Kale moved faster than his injured state should have allowed. He grabbed the rifle from where he'd left it, crossed to the window, and peered through the gap in the curtain. His body went rigid, every muscle tensing in recognition of whatever he saw in the darkness. More of them, he said quietly, almost to himself then, louder, directed toward the back room. Different group coming from the west. Nali emerged from the room, still holding the sleeping child. Istis followed, knife ready, her eyes scanning. For threats. Through the window, they could see shapes moving in the moonlight. For figures on foot spread. Out, approaching with the careful movements of hunters stalking prey. The ones with the badge. Istis asked her, voice hard. Kyle shook his head slowly, his jaw still bleeding. Worse, these are bounty hunters. Someone put money on you. They don't care about law or territory or anything except collecting. Payment. He moved away from the window. Thinking rapidly, his eyes swept across. His small house, calculating options, weighing impossible choices. There's a root cellar, he said finally. Beneath. The kitchen, hidden panel. You can fit down there with the child. Stay quiet. Stay still. They won't find it. And you? Niall heard herself ask. Kyle checked the rifle's ammunition. His movements mechanical. Practiced. I'll tell them. The same thing I told the others. Send them on their way. They won't believe you twice in one night, Istis said. Flatly. Probably not. Kale's mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile if pain hadn't been. Threaded through it. But they'll have to go through me to search. That might slow them down enough. He crossed to the kitchen, knelt, and pulled up a section of floorboard that looked no different from any other. Beneath it, darkness opened up into a space just large enough for two women and a small child. The smell of earth and old vegetables rose. From below. Get in now. Don't come out until I say it's clear. No matter what. You hear. Niley's legs wouldn't move. She stood frozen, staring at this man, who kept putting himself between them and death, kept bleeding for them, kept choosing their survival over his own. Safety. It made no sense. It contradicted everything she'd been taught, everything she'd experienced, everything that had shaped her understanding of the world. Why do you keep doing this? The words came out, broken, desperate for understanding. Kale's eyes met hers, and in them she saw something ancient and wounded. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of confession. 15 years ago, I rode with a militia group. We were told we were protecting settlers, told that your people were threats that needed eliminating. He paused, his hands, gripping the rifle so hard his knuckles went white. We came across a camp, women and children, mostly old people. They were running, trying to get away from the fighting. We had orders. The silence that followed was suffocating. I followed those orders. Kale continued, his voice barely above a whisper now. Did things I can't take back, can't fix, can't make right, no matter how many years I hide out here, trying to forget. Istis had gone perfectly still. Her knife hand trembling with barely contained fury. Nali felt tears burning behind her eyes, rage and grief, and confusion all tangled together. So, you think saving us makes up for that? Istis' voice was pure venom. No. Kale's answer was immediate and certain. Nothing makes up for that, but I can choose different now. Can be different now, even if it's too late to matter. The shapes outside were closer now, almost to the house. Time had run. Out for questions, for understanding, for anything except survival. Kale gestured urgently toward the open cellar. Get down there, please. And despite everything, despite the rage and the grief and the impossible contradiction of a monster trying to be human, Nieli moved toward the opening. Because her child needed to live. Because survival meant accepting help even from bloodstained hands. She climbed down into the darkness, Istis following with reluctant fury above them. The floorboard slid back into place, sealing them in earth-scented blackness. Through the cracks between boards, they heard Kale's boots cross. The floor, heard the door open, heard his voice, steady despite everything, call out into the night. That's far enough. The men who emerged from the darkness were different from Masons. Group. Harder, meaner. They wore no badges, carried no pretense of authority, just weapons and the cold. Calculation of men who killed for profit. The leader was thin, almost skeletal, with a face that looked like it had been carved from leather left too long in the sun. He carried a rifle loosely, the way someone carries a tool they've used 1,000 times. Evening, he said, his voice surprisingly pleasant. We're looking for some lost property. 2 Apache women, 1 child, worth good money to certain parties. You wouldn't happen to have seen them. Kyle stood in his doorway, blocking entry with his body. Blood still stained his chin from the earlier confrontation. Already told another group the same thing tonight. Haven't seen anyone. You're the second set of people to bother me on my own land. The thin man smiled, showing teeth that had gone brown. Oh, we know about Mason and his boys. Heard they came through here. Heard you gave them trouble. He took a step closer. See, that makes us curious. Makes us think maybe you did see something. Maybe you're one of those sympathizers who doesn't understand how things work out here. I understand just fine. I also understand property rights and the value of being left alone. Another of the bounty hunters, shorter but broader, moved to flank Hale's position. The third and fourth spread out, surrounding the house with practiced efficiency. They'd done this before, knew how to corner prey. Here's how this goes, the thin man said, still smiling. You step aside. Let's look around. If we find what we're looking for, you get to keep breathing. If you keep causing problems, well, he shrugged. Accidents happen in isolated places. Kale's grip on his rifle tightened. You'll find I'm not easy to accidentally kill. Maybe not, but you're one man with one rifle. We're for men who get paid whether you're alive or dead when we're finished. In the cellar, Nieli pressed her hand over the child's mouth, keeping her silent. Ista's breathing had gone shallow with rage. Her body coiled like a spring, ready to release. They could see fragments of the scene through the cracks. Could hear every word with terrible clarity. Kyle's voice came again. Harder now. You take one more. Step toward my door. We find out how many of you I can take with me. The thin man's smile finally faded. He raised his rifle in a smooth motion, leveling it at Kyle's chest. The other 3 did the same, weapons trained on the doorway. From multiple angles. Last chance, the thin man said. Step aside or die. Stupid. What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but felt like it stretched across years. Kyle fired. First, his shot caught the Broadman in the shoulder, spinning him around. Return fire erupted immediately, 4 rifles discharging almost simultaneously. The night exploded with sound and smoke and the sharp smell of gunpowder. Kale went down, his body jerking as bullets found him. His rifle clattered across the porch, but even falling, he managed to fire once more. The shot going wild, but forcing the hunters to scatter for cover. In the cellar beneath the kitchen floor, Nellie bit down on her own hand to keep from screaming. Ista's entire body shook, torn between the instinct to fight and the knowledge that revealing themselves now would make Kale's sacrifice meaningless. Above them, boots thundered across the porch. Voices shouted. Commands. Someone kicked Kale's rifle away. The thin man's voice rose above the chaos. Search the house. Tear it apart if you have to. Nolly heard footsteps directly above her head. Moving through the kitchen, heard furniture being overturned, cabinets opened and emptied. The child stirred in her arms, beginning to wake, and Nieli pressed her closer, desperate to keep her quiet. A boot stomped on the floorboards inches from where the hidden panel lay. Once, twice, testing for hollow sounds. Then from outside, a new sound cut through everything else. The thunder of approaching horses. Many horses coming fast. Someone's coming. One of the hunters called out. Riders from the east. How many? Can't tell. Maybe a dozen. Coming hard. The thin man cursed viciously. Grab what you can carry. We're leaving. Not getting caught in a crossfire out here. What about him? Someone gestured toward where Kyle lay. Leave him. He's done. Let's move. The footsteps retreated, rapid and urgent. More gunshots echoed as the hunters fired toward the approaching riders. Then the sound of running, of men fleeing into the darkness they'd emerged from. The new riders arrived moments later, their voices calling out, checking the scene. But the bounty hunters had vanished into the vast emptiness of the desert night. In the cellar, Naeli and Istis remained frozen, not daring to move, listening to Boots walk across the floor above them, listening to voices discuss what they'd found and outside on the porch where he'd chosen to make his stand. Kale lay bleeding into the wood he'd walked across every day for 15 years. The voices above spoke in Apache. Neil's breath caught. Ista's hand gripped her arm so hard it left marks through the cracks in the floorboards above them. They heard rapid conversation, urgent and searching, then footsteps, deliberate, crossing directly to where they hid beneath the kitchen floor. The hidden panel lifted. A face appeared in the opening, weathered and familiar. Takakota, her mother's brother, stared down at them with an expression that mixed relief and grief in equal measure. We've been tracking you for 3 days, he said quietly in their language. Come up. It's safe now. Nieli climbed out first, passing the child up to waiting. Hands then pulled herself through the opening. Istis followed, her knife still ready despite recognizing the faces. Around them, 6 Apache riders stood in Kale's small kitchen, their weapons lowered but ready. The man outside, Takakota said carefully, watching their faces. He protected you? Naeli nodded, unable to form words yet. Her uncle's expression darkened with confusion, with questions that had no easy answers. He's dying, another voice said from the doorway. 3 bullets. Maybe 4 won't last the night. The words hit Naeli like a physical blow. She moved without thinking, pushing past the gathered men, stepping out onto the porch where Kale lay and spreading. Darkness that wasn't shadow. He was still breathing, but each breath rattled wet and labored in his chest. His eyes were open, staring up at the stars scattered across the endless sky. Blood pulled beneath him, soaking into wood that would carry that stain forever. When he heard her approach, his eyes shifted slightly. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by something that might have been relief. You're safe, he whispered, the words barely audible. Good, that's good. Naeli knelt beside him, her hands hovering uselessly over wounds she had no power to heal. Behind her, Istis emerged from the house, stopping short when she saw him. The fury that had carried her through years of survival wavered, replaced by something more complicated, something that had no name. We could try to move him, Takakota said from the doorway, but he wouldn't survive the journey. Kyle's hand moved slightly, a gesture that said not to bother. His eyes stayed on Naeli's face. Told you he managed. Not trying to make up for the past. Just choosing different. Just being different. That's all any of us can do. Naeli's hands were shaking. This man, this stranger who had been taught to see her as less than human, who had followed those teachings into unforgivable places, had chosen to die rather than let history repeat itself. Through him, I understand, she whispered, and meant it in ways that would take years to fully unpack. Istis moved forward, then kneeling on Kale's other side. She reached out slowly, her hand covering his wear-it, lay against his chest. The gesture was small but carried the weight of breaking cycles that had ground through generations like millstones. You could have run, Istis said quietly. Could have. Told them where we were. Could have saved yourself. Kale's mouth twisted into something between smile and grimace. 15 years was long enough being the monster. Figured it was time to try being human. His breathing grew more labored. The stars above seemed to brighten as his eyes began to dim. Takakota stepped forward, placing a hand on Niall's shoulder. We need to leave. Mason and his group will return, and those bounty hunters might circle back. This place isn't safe. Neely looked down at Kale, at this impossible man who had proven that people could choose to be more than their worst moments. That redemption might not erase the past, but could shape a different future. We don't leave him alone, she said firmly. Not like this. So they stayed. 6 Apache riders and 2 exhausted women and 1 small child keeping watch over a dying man who had been their enemy and their savior both. They stayed as his breathing slowed as the stars wheeled overhead as the night deepened toward dawn. When Kyle finally stopped breathing, Nellie closed his eyes with gentle fingers. They buried him at sunrise in the land he'd chosen for penance and transformation. No marquer, no words, just earth returned to earth. As they rode away, Nellie looked back, once at the small house, standing alone in the vast emptiness. She carried new understanding now, complex and painful, and true. Monsters could choose to become men. Men could choose to become better. And sometimes the most powerful act was simply choosing differently when the moment came. The child slept peacefully in her arms, alive because a stranger had decided that redemption mattered more than survival. Behind them, the desert stretched endless and indifferent, holding secrets of transformation that would never be spoken, but would be carried forward in the lives he'd saved and the choice he'd made when it mattered most. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the untamed frontier where courage and sacrifice reshape everything we thought we knew. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you powerful stories like these. Your support means the world to